The police told me there was no such room in my house. They stood in my living room, polite and tired, flipping through their notes, and said the same thing 3 different ways. The floor plan didn't show it. The previous owner hadn't mentioned it. The inspector's report didn't list it. According to every piece of paper they had, the room where I'd found the footprints simply didn't exist. And yet, I was the one who had cleaned the blood off its door handle. It started 3 months earlier, when I moved into the house on Cedar Ridge Road. I was 56, recently retired, and very tired of apartments. My wife had passed 2 years before, my son lived 3 states away, and I wanted something quiet. Something simple. The house was a single-story place built sometime in the late 70s, sitting on a low hill outside a small town in Pennsylvania. No close neighbors. Too much yard. Too many trees. Perfect, I thought. The realtor called it solid but forgotten. That should have been my first warning. The first few weeks were exactly what I'd hoped for. I painted the bedroom. Fixed a leaky faucet. Spent evenings on the back porch with a cup of coffee, listening to insects and distant traffic. The kind of quiet that feels earned. The kind that lets your head finally slow down. Then I started noticing the door. It was at the end of the hallway, past the guest room and the small storage closet. A narrow door, painted the same off-white as the walls, with a cheap brass handle. I assumed it was another closet. Or maybe a utility space. The kind of place you forget about because you never need it. The strange thing was, I didn't remember seeing it during the walkthrough. That didn't bother me much at first. Houses have doors. You miss things. Especially when you're more focused on roofs and plumbing and whether the heating system still works. I noticed it properly one evening when I was vacuuming the hallway. The cord caught on the corner of the door, and I muttered to myself, annoyed that it was in the way. I remember standing there for a second, looking at it, trying to recall what was behind it. I didn't open it. I should have. A few nights later, I woke up to a sound that didn't belong in a quiet house. It wasn't a bang or a crash. It was softer than that. A dull, steady thump. Like someone knocking on a wall from the other side. Not in a hurry. Not trying to get attention. Just, testing. Thump. Pause. Thump. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, listening. At first I thought it was the pipes. Old houses make noises. Everyone knows that. But this was too deliberate. Too evenly spaced. It was coming from the hallway. I got up, grabbed the flashlight from my nightstand, and opened the bedroom door. The hallway was dark and empty. The sound had stopped. I stood there for a full minute, listening, my heart doing that slow, heavy thing it does when your body isn't sure if you're in danger yet. Nothing. I told myself it was the house settling and went back to bed. Over the next 2 weeks, the sounds came back 3 more times. Always late. Always soft. Always from the same direction. And always stopping the moment I stepped into the hallway. That's when I started paying attention to the door. Sometimes, I could swear it hadn't been there the day before. I know how that sounds. But I'd walk past it in the morning and not think about it, and then in the evening I'd notice it and feel that small, cold pinch in my stomach. Like when you walk into a room and realize something has been moved, but you can't remember how it used to be. Once, I was sure it had been slightly open. Just a crack. Not enough to see inside. Enough to notice. I closed it. The handle was cold. That night, I dreamed I was standing in the hallway, watching the door open by itself. In the dream, I couldn't move. I couldn't speak. I just stood there while something on the other side breathed, slow and wet, like it had been waiting for me to notice. I woke up before I saw what it was. The next morning, there were muddy footprints in the hallway. They started near the front door and went straight down the hall. They stopped right in front of the door I didn't trust. At first, I honestly thought someone had broken in. I grabbed my phone and walked the house, checking every room, every window, every lock. Everything was still closed. Nothing was missing. The back door was still bolted the way I always left it. The windows were untouched. The footprints didn't belong to me. They were too big, for one thing. And the tread pattern wasn't from any of my shoes. They looked fresh. Wet. Like whoever made them had come in from the yard. And then just stood there. Facing that door. I called the local police. A young officer and an older one came out. They walked the house with me, nodded at the footprints, took a few pictures, and asked the usual questions. No signs of forced entry. No alarm system triggered. No neighbors who'd seen anything. The older officer asked me what was behind the door. I told him I wasn't sure. That was the first time I realized how strange that sounded. We opened it together. There was a small room behind it. Maybe 6 feet by 8. No windows. No furniture. Just bare walls and a concrete floor. It smelled old. Dusty. A little damp. The officer frowned and asked what I used it for. I told him I'd never been inside before. They exchanged a look I didn't like. They checked the room, of course. Nothing inside. No signs of anyone hiding. No mud on the floor. No footprints. The younger officer suggested maybe I'd tracked the mud in without realizing it. I didn't argue, but I knew he was wrong. After they left, I stood in the hallway for a long time, looking at the open door. I don't remember closing it. A week later, I found the first scratch marks. They were on the inside of the door frame. Long, thin lines in the wood. Deep enough to catch your fingernail. They weren't there before. I'm sure of it. That night, the thumping came back. Closer this time. Not from the hallway. From inside the walls. I pressed my ear to the plaster and listened. There was something moving. Slowly. Carefully. Like it was trying not to be heard. The next morning, I called a contractor. He came out, looked at the hallway, looked at the door, and frowned. "This isn't on the original plan," he said. "What isn't?" "This room. It shouldn't be here." He showed me the old blueprints he'd pulled from the county records. The hallway was shorter on paper. The space where the door was supposed to be was solid wall. No room. No door. Nothing. He joked that maybe I'd found a secret bunker. Then he laughed and said he'd never seen anything like it before. Neither had I. 2 nights later, I woke up to the sound of the door handle turning. Slowly. Carefully. Like whoever was on the other side didn't want it to click. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. The handle stopped. There was a long, awful silence. Then something scratched the wood. Right where my face would be if I were standing in the hallway. In the morning, there was blood on the handle. Not much. Just enough to prove I hadn't imagined it. That was when I called the police again. And that's how I ended up standing in my living room, listening to a man in a uniform tell me that, according to every record they had, the room I'd just shown them did not exist. After the officers left, I sat at my kitchen table for a long time without turning on the lights. The house felt different when it was dark. Not louder. Not quieter. Just watchful. Like the walls were paying attention. I kept thinking about what the older officer had said, standing there with his notebook half closed, his voice careful. "Sir, according to the county records, this house doesn't have that room. The hallway should end about 6 feet earlier." He'd said it like he was explaining a clerical error. A missing signature. A misfiled form. Not like he was telling me part of my house wasn't supposed to exist. They'd walked through it again before leaving. Me, them, and the contractor, all standing in that narrow space, shining flashlights at bare walls like we were on a bad tour. No seams. No obvious additions. No sign it had been carved out later. Just a room that shouldn't be there. When I finally went to bed, I left the hallway light on. I don't remember falling asleep. I do remember waking up. There was a sound in the house that didn't belong to any normal list of nighttime noises. Not the heater. Not the pipes. Not the wood cooling. It was the sound of something heavy being dragged. Slow. Uneven. Stopping and starting, like whoever, or whatever, was doing it needed to rest. It was coming from the hallway. I stayed in bed, staring at the open bedroom door, watching the strip of light on the floor. Waiting for a shadow to cross it. Nothing did. The sound stopped on its own. I waited another 10 minutes before getting up. When I finally looked out into the hallway, everything looked the same. The door was closed. The light was still on. The carpet was undisturbed. But the smell was different. There was a faint, sour odor in the air. Metallic. Like old water and something else I couldn't quite place. It was strongest near the door. I didn't open it. The next day, I drove into town and went to the county office myself. I'm not a conspiracy-minded person. I don't enjoy arguing with clerks. But I needed to see those records with my own eyes. The woman at the counter was patient, if a little confused about why a retired man was so interested in a 40-year-old floor plan. She printed out the files and spread them across the desk. She was right. The hallway ended early. The wall where the door was supposed to be was solid on every version of the plan. Sometimes owners add things without permits, she said. Maybe a closet. Or a panic room. Or something like that. This isn't added, I said. It's part of the house. She gave me a look that said she didn't know what to do with that sentence. Before I left, I asked about previous owners. There had been 3 before me. The most recent was a couple who'd lived there less than 5 years before moving out of state. Before them, an older man who'd owned the house for nearly 2 decades. He'd died in it. Heart attack, according to the record. No family. No heirs. The house had gone through an estate sale and then to the couple. I asked if there had been any police reports. Break-ins. Complaints. Anything strange. She shook her head. Not that I can see. That night, I tried to stay awake. I sat in the living room with the TV on low, pretending to watch a documentary I didn't care about. Every few minutes, my eyes went to the hallway. The door didn't move. Around 1 in the morning, I heard something that made my skin crawl. It wasn't coming from the hallway this time. It was coming from inside the room. A soft, steady sound. Like someone breathing through their nose. I muted the TV and listened. In. Out. In. Out. Too slow to be mine. Too close to be imagination. I stood up and took 1 step toward the hallway. The sound stopped. The silence that followed felt heavier than noise. I didn't sleep that night. In the morning, I noticed the door was open. Just a few inches. Enough to see the dark inside. I stood there, coffee growing cold in my hand, and stared at that narrow black line. I don't know how long I stood there before I realized something was wrong with the hallway itself. The carpet near the door looked disturbed. Not torn. Not dirty. Compressed. Like something heavy had been standing there for a long time. Facing the door. I closed it. That afternoon, I called my son. I didn't tell him everything. I didn't talk about blueprints or breathing or blood on handles. I told him I'd found something strange in the house and that it was making me uneasy. He laughed a little and said, "Dad, you finally moved somewhere quiet. Your brain's just looking for something to worry about." Maybe he was right. That evening, I went into town again and bought a cheap motion-activated camera. The kind people use to watch their front porch or keep an eye on pets. I set it up in the hallway, angled straight at the door. I told myself this was just for peace of mind. That night, I slept in my clothes. When I checked the camera in the morning, there was nothing. No movement. No shadows. No glitches. Just 8 hours of an empty hallway and a closed door. I felt stupid for being relieved. For 3 days, nothing happened. No sounds. No smells. No movement. I started to think maybe the stress had finally burned itself out. Maybe I'd scared myself and the house had simply gone back to being what it was before. Just walls and rooms and quiet. On the 4th night, the camera caught something. It wasn't dramatic. That was the worst part. At 2:17 a.m. the door handle turned. Slowly. The door opened less than an inch. And then it stopped. It stayed that way for almost a full minute. Nothing came out. Nothing went in. Then the door closed again. I watched the clip over and over, sitting at my kitchen table, the morning light coming in through the window. There was no shadow under the door. No visible hand. Just the handle moving by itself. When I went to the hallway, the door was closed, just like in the video. But this time, there were marks on the carpet. Thin, dark lines. Like something had been dragged out of the room and then pulled back in. I didn't go to the police. I don't know why. Maybe because I could already hear the questions. Maybe because I didn't want to see that look again. The one that says they're being polite but they don't believe you. Instead, I called the couple who'd owned the house before me. It took some searching, but I found a number connected to the name on the deed. The woman who answered sounded surprised to hear from me. "Yes, we lived there," she said. "For a few years." "Why?" I asked her about the hallway. There was a pause. "Aren't you calling about the plumbing or something?" "No," I said. "I'm calling about the room at the end of the hall." Another pause. Longer this time. "What room?" she asked. My stomach tightened. "The small one. No windows. Past the guest room." She laughed, but there was something thin about it. "There's no room there. Just a wall. We had a bookcase against it." I told her what I'd found. I told her about the door. I told her about the footprints. When I finished, she didn't say anything for a long time. Then she said, very quietly, "My husband used to hear things at night." "What kind of things?" "Scratching," she said. "And knocking. Always from that end of the hall." "Did you ever see a door there?" "No," she said. "But sometimes it felt like the hallway was longer than it should be." I asked her why they'd moved. She hesitated. "We never slept through the night in that house," she said. "Not once. After a while, we just couldn't do it anymore." When the call ended, I sat there with my phone in my hand, staring at the wall like it might answer me. That night, I didn't turn the hallway light on. I wanted to see the dark. At 1:43 a.m., the door opened. Not a crack. Not an inch. All the way. And something stood in the doorway long enough for the camera to register that the darkness there was thicker than the darkness in the hall. Then it stepped back inside. And the door closed. I didn't watch the footage again that night. I turned the camera off, unplugged it, and left it face down on the kitchen counter like it was something that might look back at me if I wasn't careful. Sleep wasn't an option. I sat in the living room with all the lights on, listening to the house settle and trying to convince myself that what I'd seen was just a trick of shadow and timing. The kind of thing your brain turns into a monster when you're already on edge. Morning didn't make it better. In daylight, the hallway looked normal. Ordinary. The kind of place you'd walk through 100 times without thinking. The door was there, closed, painted the same tired off-white as before. I stood in front of it for a long time before opening it. The room was empty. No furniture. No stains. No obvious sign that anything had ever stood there in the dark. The air inside was cool and stale, like a space that rarely got disturbed. But the smell was stronger. That faint metallic note was back, mixed with something old and sour. I checked the walls, the floor, even the ceiling, half expecting to find a leak or mold or some dead animal trapped inside. Nothing. What I did find, though, were more marks. They were on the inside wall, about waist height. Shallow grooves in the paint and plaster. Not random. Not messy. Parallel. Like something had been pressed there again and again, always in the same place. I closed the door and leaned against the hallway wall, suddenly very aware of how alone I was in that house. That afternoon, I drove to the local library. Small towns keep strange things in their libraries. Old newspapers. Obituaries nobody remembers. The quiet history of places that don't think they have any stories worth telling. I asked the woman at the desk if they had archived copies of the local paper from the 80s and 90s. She pointed me toward a row of microfilm machines that looked older than my first car. It took a while to get the hang of it. Scrolling, squinting, scrolling back. Page after page of high school sports scores and church announcements and grocery store ads. Then I started finding the things people stop noticing after a while. A short article about a man found dead in his home on Cedar Ridge Road. No foul play suspected. Natural causes. Lived alone. Another, a few years later. Different name. Same road. Then another. Not close together. Sometimes 5 years apart. Sometimes 10. Always alone. Always in their homes. Always, no signs of struggle. I copied down the names. There were 4 of them before the couple who'd sold the house. 4 people who'd lived alone. 4 people who died there. That night, I dreamed I was standing in the hallway again. The door was open. The room was bigger on the inside than it should have been. The walls were breathing. When I woke up, my bedroom door was open. I know I'd closed it. The hallway was dark. And the door at the end of it was open, too. I stayed in bed and listened. Somewhere in the house, something was moving. Not fast. Not loud. Just enough to let me know it was there. In the morning, I found dirt on the kitchen floor. Not footprints this time. Just smudges. Like something had been dragged across the tile. They led to the hallway. And stopped. Right in front of the door. I called the older officer back. The one who'd looked at me like he wasn't sure whether to take me seriously or not. To his credit, he came. He brought another man with him this time. Someone in plain clothes. He introduced himself as being from the county. They listened while I told them about the camera. About the marks. About the articles I'd found. They walked the hallway. They opened the door. They stood in the room and looked around in silence. This shouldn't be here, the man from the county said, finally. Structurally, it doesn't make sense. Then what is it? I asked. He didn't answer. They took pictures. Measured the walls. Tapped on things. The officer asked if I had any family nearby. Somewhere else I could stay for a few nights. I told him I didn't. He nodded slowly, like he'd expected that answer. That evening, I got a call from my son. He'd looked up the address, he said. Just out of curiosity. Dad, he said, did you know the house used to be part of a larger property? No, I said. Back in the 70s, there was a small care facility out there. Not a hospital. More like a private place. It burned down. The land got sold off in pieces. Your house is on part of it. What kind of care facility? He hesitated. The kind people didn't like to talk about. I didn't sleep at all that night. Around 3 in the morning, I heard the sound again. Not knocking. Not dragging. Scratching. From inside the walls. Slow. Careful. Moving along the hallway. Stopping near my bedroom door. I sat on the edge of my bed, holding my phone, not sure who I'd even call. The scratching stopped. Then there was a new sound. A soft, wet exhale. Right on the other side of my door. In the morning, there was a single handprint on the outside of my bedroom door. It wasn't muddy. It wasn't dusty. It was clean. Like something warm had touched it from the other side. I didn't touch the handprint. I stood there for a long time, staring at it on my bedroom door, trying to decide whether it was worse to wipe it away or to leave it exactly where it was. In the end, I took a photo and then cleaned it off, scrubbing harder than I needed to, like I could erase whatever had made it by force. It didn't make me feel better. That morning, I drove back into town and went somewhere I should have gone earlier, the local historical society. It was a small brick building next to the library, half museum, half storage unit for things nobody else wanted to keep. A woman in her 60s sat behind the desk, reading a paperback and drinking coffee from a chipped mug. When I told her the address, she raised her eyebrows. People usually come here before they buy out there, she said. Not after. I asked her about the care facility my son had mentioned. She nodded slowly and disappeared into the back room. When she came back, she had a thin folder and a look on her face that told me this wasn't a story she enjoyed revisiting. It wasn't officially a hospital, she said. More like a private residence for people who couldn't live on their own. Different times. Different rules. What happened to it? I asked. Fire, she said. Late 70s. Middle of the night. Old wiring, they said. Anyone die? She paused. 2 residents. And 1 staff member. She slid the folder across the desk. Inside were photocopies of newspaper articles and a few black and white photos. Grainy shots of a long, low building. A crowd of people standing behind a line of tape. Smoke rising into the dark. I recognized the shape of the hill in the background. It was my hill. What was it called? I asked. She hesitated. Most people just called it Cedar House. I didn't like that. I asked about the land afterward. She told me what my son already had. The property was broken up and sold in pieces. Houses went up over the years. Mine was one of the later ones. People don't usually stay long out there, she added, like it was a joke. They tend to move on. Why? She looked at me for a moment. They say it's quiet, she said. But not the good kind. I drove home with that sentence stuck in my head. The house was silent when I walked in. Too silent. You get used to the normal sounds of a place. The low hum of electricity. The distant noise of traffic. The small, constant reminders that a building is just a shell full of air and wires. That afternoon, it felt like the air itself was holding still. I walked the hallway. The door was closed. I didn't open it. Instead, I went into the garage and started digging through the boxes I hadn't unpacked yet. Old paperwork. Manuals. Receipts. The kind of things you tell yourself you'll organize later. In one of the boxes, I found something I didn't remember putting there. It was an envelope. Yellowed. Brittle at the edges. My address was written on the front in neat, careful handwriting. Inside was a single sheet of paper. No letterhead. No signature. Just a list of names. 4 of them. They were the same names I'd written down at the library. Underneath them, in smaller writing, was one more name. A name I didn't recognize. And beneath that, one sentence. It doesn't like being alone. I sat on the garage floor for a long time, holding that piece of paper and trying to remember ever seeing it before. I couldn't. That evening, I called the woman who'd lived in the house before me again. This time, her husband answered. He sounded tired. I told him what I'd found. About the articles. About the envelope. He didn't interrupt me. When I finished, he said, "We never saw a door." "But you heard things," I said. "Yes." "What kind of things?" "Movement," he said. "At night. Always in the hallway. Sometimes it sounded like someone was standing there for a long time. Not walking. Just there." "Why didn't you tell anyone?" There was a long pause. "Because we couldn't prove anything," he said. "And because when we talked about moving, it stopped. For a while. That night, I decided I wasn't going to sleep in the bedroom. I sat up on the couch with a blanket and left the hallway light on. I turned the camera back on and pointed it at the door again. Around midnight, I heard something that made my stomach drop. The sound of the hallway light clicking off. I hadn't touched the switch. The living room was still lit. The kitchen was still lit. But the hallway was dark. Then, very slowly, the light came back on. Like someone had flipped the switch and then changed their mind. I checked the camera in the morning. At 12:04 a.m., the hallway light went off. At 12:06 a.m., it came back on. In between, there was movement in the dark. Not a clear shape. Just a darker section of darkness, passing in front of the lens. Later that day, I found another mark. This one was on the wall outside the door. Not a scratch. Not a stain. A dent. Like something had leaned there. Hard. That evening, I went to see my neighbor. The only one close enough to walk to. A man in his 70s who'd lived there longer than anyone else on the road. When I told him my address, he nodded slowly. "Used to be trouble out there," he said. "What kind of trouble?" He shrugged. "People who stayed too long. People who left in a hurry. Folks who swore the place didn't want them there." "Did anyone ever talk about a room that shouldn't exist?" He looked at me for a long time before answering. "Some doors aren't for people," he said. That's all I ever heard. That night, I dreamed of a hallway that never ended. Doors on both sides. All of them closed. All of them breathing. When I woke up, the door at the end of my real hallway was wide open. And this time, the room behind it was not empty. The first thing I noticed was the chair. It didn't belong in that room. The small, windowless space at the end of the hallway had always been empty. Bare walls. Concrete floor. Nothing to look at, nothing to touch. That was part of what made it so unsettling. It felt like a place that wasn't meant to be used. But now, in the center of the room, there was a wooden chair. Not a folding chair. Not something light and temporary. A heavy, old dining chair with a high back and one leg that had been repaired at some point with a strip of darker wood. It was facing the door. I stood in the hallway, holding the doorframe, trying to understand what I was looking at. I knew every piece of furniture in my house. I'd brought it all myself. I didn't own a chair like that. And even if I had, there was no reason for it to be in there. The air in the room felt colder than the hallway. Not by much. Just enough to notice. I didn't go in. I took a step back and felt something unpleasant settle in my chest. The kind of feeling you get when you realize you've already missed the moment where you should have left. I went to the kitchen and grabbed my phone. My hand was shaking enough that I had to sit down before I could unlock it. I called the police again. This time, 2 different officers came. Younger than the last pair. More alert. Less patient. They walked the house with me. They looked at the chair. They looked at me. "Where did this come from?" one of them asked. "I don't know," I said. "It wasn't here yesterday." They checked the doors. The windows. The garage. No signs of forced entry. No broken locks. No open windows. "Maybe someone's messing with you," the other officer said. "A neighbor." "Kids." "There are no kids out here," I said. "And no one lives close enough to do this without being seen." They took pictures. Wrote things down. Asked if I wanted to stay somewhere else for a few nights. I said no. I don't know why I said no. Pride, maybe. Or stubbornness. Or the stupid idea that if I left, I'd never understand what was happening in my own house. After they left, I stood in the hallway and looked at the chair for a long time. Finally, I went into the garage, got a pair of work gloves, and went back. The chair was heavier than it looked. When I grabbed it, I felt something sticky on the underside of the seat. I didn't look. I carried it out of the room and into the garage, set it down near the trash bins, and went back inside. Then I closed the door to the room and pushed a small table in front of it. That night, I locked my bedroom door. I woke up to the sound of wood scraping against carpet. Slow. Unsteady. Like something being dragged. I didn't move. I didn't open my eyes. I just listened. The sound came from the hallway. It stopped. There was a long pause. Then I heard the table being pushed. In the morning, the door was open again. The table was back where it had been before. And the chair was in the room. This time, it was closer to the doorway. I felt sick. I went into the garage. The spot where I'd left the chair was empty. There were faint marks on the concrete floor. Scuffs. Like something heavy had been dragged back toward the house. I checked the camera footage. At 3:12 a.m., the hallway camera showed the table moving. Not fast. Not violently. It slid a few inches to the side. Then a few more. Then it stopped. The door opened. Something dark moved behind it, but the camera couldn't make out a shape. A few minutes later, the chair appeared in the frame, sliding backward into the room as if pulled by invisible hands. The door closed. I sat there, watching that clip over and over, until my eyes started to burn. That afternoon, I drove back to the Historical Society. The same woman was there. When I told her what I'd found, she didn't look surprised. She went into the back again and came out with a thicker folder this time. There were complaints, she said. Back when Cedar House was still open. About things being moved. About residents being found in places they couldn't get to on their own. Were there rooms like this? I asked. She hesitated. There were isolation rooms, she said. Small ones. No windows. Used when someone was difficult. Did any of them survive the fire? Most of the building didn't, she said. But foundations have a way of staying. That night, I didn't go back to the house right away. I sat in my car at the end of the driveway and watched the dark shape of it against the trees. One light came on in the hallway. I knew I'd turned all the lights off before I left. I went inside anyway. The chair was still there, facing the door. Something had been placed on it. A folded piece of paper. I didn't touch it at first. I just stood there, trying to slow my breathing. When I finally picked it up, my hands were cold. It was the same yellowed paper as the one I'd found in the garage. On it, in the same careful handwriting, were 4 words. "It gets lonely too." Behind me, in the hallway, I heard the soft, familiar sound of something breathing. I didn't sleep in the house that night and instead sat in my car at the edge of the driveway until dawn, watching the hallway window where the light kept turning on and off at irregular intervals, and when I finally forced myself to go back inside in the morning, the chair was no longer in the room but in the hallway, positioned a few feet from my bedroom door as if it had been carefully placed there, and that was the moment I understood it wasn't just moving things, it was choosing where they should be. So I called my son and told him everything without softening it, and he told me to leave immediately, to stay in a hotel, to stop pretending I could outthink a house that didn't agree with its own walls. But when I tried to pack, I found that boxes I had already emptied were full again, not with my things but with objects I didn't recognize, old clothes, cracked dishes, a child's shoe, and folded at the bottom of one box there was another sheet of that yellowed paper with the same handwriting saying, "They forget themselves here," and I drove to town shaking and showed it to the woman at the Historical Society, who went quiet and finally admitted there were rumors after the fire that some of the isolation rooms had been sealed off instead of demolished because nobody wanted to deal with what was left inside them, and when I asked her what that meant she said sometimes records don't survive but habits do, and when I came back the front door was unlocked even though I knew I'd locked it, and the hallway smelled like that metallic rot again, and the camera was unplugged and sitting on the floor facing the wall as if someone didn't like being watched, and I heard movement not behind the door but above me, in the ceiling, slow and deliberate like weight being shifted carefully to avoid making noise, and I realized with a cold certainty that the room was not the only place it used, it was just the place it preferred to leave things, and I backed out of the house and called the police again, and this time they brought the county inspector and a man from fire safety, and they argued in my living room about floor plans and load-bearing walls while I stood there watching the hallway light flicker even though no one was near the switch, and when they finally opened the door together the room was empty again, no chair, no paper, no marks, just bare concrete and dust, and the inspector said maybe I'd been under stress and the officer suggested carbon monoxide, and I almost believed them until I noticed the dust on the floor had a clean oval in the center like something heavy had been standing there for a long time and had only just been moved, and that night in the motel I dreamed of a long corridor with doors that led to smaller rooms and smaller rooms inside those, and in every one there was something left behind, not a person, just what they'd stopped needing, and when I woke up my phone had a new photo I didn't remember taking, a blurry image of my hallway, my bedroom door, and the chair positioned exactly where it had been that morning, and underneath it a message saved in my own notes that I swear I didn't write that said, "It doesn't keep what fights it," and that was when I understood that leaving the house wouldn't end it, because whatever had learned the shape of that place had also learned the shape of me. I stayed away from the house for 3 days, sleeping badly in a cheap motel and jumping every time someone walked past my door, and during that time my son tried to convince me to let him handle everything, to sell the place, to walk away, but I couldn't shake the feeling that the house wasn't finished with me, so on the 4th morning I drove back with a county locksmith and a friend of his who did structural work, and they both laughed nervously about haunted houses until we stood in the hallway and the friend said the wall measurements didn't line up, that the space taken by the room was more than the exterior of the house should allow, and while they argued about how that was possible I noticed the hallway felt longer again, not by much, just enough that the front door looked slightly farther away than it should have, and when the locksmith tried to remove the door it resisted like it was under tension, the screws coming out but the frame refusing to loosen, and when it finally gave there was a sound like air being pulled into a vacuum, and the room beyond looked deeper than it had before, not wider, just deeper, like the back wall had stepped away, and the friend went inside with his flashlight and said the floor felt wrong, softer in the middle, and that was when we all heard the movement in the ceiling, slow and careful, crossing above us, and the locksmith swore and stepped back and said he was done, and I watched the dust on the floor inside the room shift into a shallow depression as if something heavy had settled there just out of sight, and the friend dropped his light and ran, and I don't blame him, because when I was alone in the hallway again I realized the doorframe was warm to the touch and the smell was stronger than ever, and I knew with a sick clarity that it wasn't hiding anymore, it was making space. And that night when I went back to the motel there was a message on my phone from an unknown number that only said, "You left something." And when I opened the attached image it was a photo of my bedroom taken from inside the hallway, the light off, the door open, and the imprint of a body visible on the carpet where I usually slept, as if something had laid there long enough to leave a memory behind, and I finally understood that the house wasn't trying to scare me, it was trying to arrange me, the same way it arranged the chair, the same way it arranged the room, not to keep me forever, just long enough to learn where I belonged. I didn't go back to the motel that night and instead drove until the sky began to lighten, then turned around because I realized I didn't know where else to go that didn't already feel compromised, and when I reached the house the front door was open and the hallway light was on and the air inside carried that same metallic rot like something had been working hard while I was gone, and the room's door was missing entirely, not open, not closed, just gone, leaving a dark rectangle in the wall. That looked deeper than any normal space should, and I stood there long enough for my eyes to adjust and saw the chair at the far end, very small now, like it had been set at the end of a tunnel, and between me and it the carpet showed a series of shallow impressions, not footprints but places where weight had rested and then shifted, as if something had crossed the hall and waited and crossed again, and I heard movement behind the walls, not one place but many, like a careful rearranging, and I thought about the names in the envelope and the way the neighbor had said some doors aren't for people, and I finally understood that the room was never the point, it was just where the house practiced, and I backed toward the front door without turning my back on the opening, and when I reached the living room the light there went out even though the sun was coming up, and I felt the floor change under my feet, not breaking, just softening, like it was learning me, and my phone vibrated with another message from that same unknown number showing a photo taken from inside the dark opening, looking out at my hallway, at me standing there, small and centered, and under it a line of text that said, "This fits better," and I left then, keys on the counter, car already running, and drove until my hands stopped shaking. But weeks later when the house was sold again and the listing photos went up online I saw that the hallway ended where it always should have and there was no door and no room and no place for a chair. And yet some nights in whatever place I'm staying now I wake up convinced the space between my bedroom and the wall is a little deeper than it was before, and I don't measure it anymore, because I know better than to show a house where I belong.